Good afternoon. I'm a little out of practice. Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland's Friday Forum. For 100 years, we remain the longest continuously running free speech forum in the country. I'm Tony Peebles, president of the City Club Forum Foundation. I've had the honor of serving as president of the City Club. I'm standing in for our current board president, Hugh McKay, who is traveling, actually on a fishing trip in Alaska with his son. Please allow me to welcome to our podium today former professor at Georgetown, Andrew S. Natsios. He's been professor there since starting in January 13th, 2006, where he served on the faculty of the Walsh School of Foreign Service. From May 2001 to January 2006, he serves as the administrator of the U.S. Government Agency for International Development, the lead U.S. government agency during the international economic development and humanitarian assistance. President Bush had also appointed him as special coordinator for the international disaster assistance and special humanitarian coordinator for the Sudan. Natsios also served as a U.S. special envoy to Sudan from October 2006 to December 2007. He is also previously serving at USAID as the director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and then also as an assistant administrator for the Bureau of Food and Humanitarian Assistance, now called the Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. He has served as the Chief Financial and Administrative Officer for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as Secretary for Administration and Finance from March 1999 to April 2000, served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives from 1975 to 1987, and was named Legislator of the Year by the Massachusetts Municipal Association in 1978. He has served in numerous public service leadership roles on the state and federal level. He has also served 23 years in the U.S. Army Reserves as a civil affairs officer. He retired in 1995 with the rank of lieutenant colonel, and he is a veteran of the Gulf War. He is a native of Holliston, Massachusetts, and currently resides in Silver Spring, Maryland, with his wife Elizabeth, and they have 3 children, Emily, Alexander, and Philip. Please welcome Andrew S. Natsios to our podium today.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the City Club for an invitation for me to speak today. I am going to speak about a subject dear to my heart, Sudan, a painful subject in many respects. And while I am an academic, I speak as a practitioner. I was the aid officer. I went to Sudan in 1989 in the middle of the Civil War, the second Civil War. There are 2 civil wars. The total number of people who died in the 2 civil wars, from a couple of very good demographers' estimates, was 4 million people. Probably the most brutal civil war in the history of Africa. I wrote a book that came out 6 weeks ago called Sudan, South Sudan and Darfur, What Everyone Needs to Know, published by Oxford University Press, and that's what I'll be speaking about today. Let me talk first about where Sudan is. I'm sure most of you know, but just to repeat, it's in northeast Africa, below Egypt, west of Ethiopia, north of Kenya. It is the largest from a geographic standpoint, country in Africa. It is 2% of the land mass of the globe, 2%. It is the size of the United States east of the Mississippi River. That just gives you some sense of the vast scale of the country. It is not densely populated by normal standards. It's very thinly populated. In many large areas, there is no one. We thought during the Civil War that most of the mass of animal populations, because if you read the accounts of the British explorers in the 18th century and some of the Egyptian and Turkish accounts from the 19th century, there are vast animal herds. The largest wetland, one of the largest wetlands in the world, the Sud, used to host millions of wild animals. We thought all of them were dead. In USAID, I sent in a team from National Geographic's Michael Fay, a very famous naturalist, with our staff and with the southern Sudanese scientists to see what was left. And there are virtually no animals left west of the Nile River, because the Nile River cuts Sudan right down the middle. And we found, however, in the east of the Nile River, there were 2.5 million animals that we had not realized were there. This is in the Sud, including several species that we thought were virtually extinct. And we found in one case one particular antelope of which there were 50,000, which was virtually extinct in the rest of Africa. So there is a huge potential in southern Sudan for tourism. Secondly, there are huge mineral and oil deposits there. No one's discovered gas yet. I believe they're going to eventually. 75% of the known oil deposits, oil reserves of historic Sudan. I'm going to use the word historic Sudan to refer to the country before the South became independent in July of last year. And so about 75% of the oil comes from the South. And there are two massive mineral deposits that they do know exist. There have been exploration that are probably more contain more wealth in them than the oil does. There's diamonds, there's huge gold deposits, there's coltan, there's massive deposits of iron and of copper. One deposit is on the Chadian border, just below Darfur. It's a disputed area now. It's clearly in the south, in my view, from a legal standpoint, but the north has occupied it. It's claiming it's their territory, mainly because it's got all this wealth in it. And then there's a part that's on the Ethiopian border on the other side of the country. So from a wealth standpoint, the south is richly endowed. It also has some of the richest soil conditions in Africa. Africa has actually very thin soils. It's not very deep. They're very fragile soils. Because of the Nile River Valley and the Nile River Delta in the southern Sudan, there are vast areas of black cotton soil, the kind of soil we see in the southern part of the Mississippi River, 60 feet deep of black soils. So I've had several agricultural scientists say we could feed all of Africa with this land, and most of it is uninhabited. That is to say, it is not densely populated, so you'd not be displacing a lot of people by farming these areas. And they're beginning now to make agreements with Chinese and other countries, commercial farmers, to come in and plant crops there. The Arabs, other Arab states are very, very much interested as well. There's a third element of this that's important, and that is that southern Sudan is the gateway into the rest of Africa from the Arab world. And the closest ally since 1989 of Iran is northern Sudan. Some people think it's Syria. It's not Syria. It's actually Sudan. The top diplomat under Ahmadinejad is now ambassador to Sudan because they're very worried about what is going on right now. The Iranians were livid that they gave up southern Sudan without a fight and pressured the Sudanese government to try to stop it militarily. The Iranian Navy has unlimited access to the Sudanese ports, Port Sudan, which is near the Suez Canal. Iranian weapons manufacturers have built factories all around Khartoum. And the intelligence service of Iran has a very intimate relationship with the NIS, which is the Mukhabarat, the secret police of northern Sudan. Ahmadinejad goes to Sudan often, and Bashir has been many times to Iran. So they have an intimate relationship, and Sudan is, and this is not these are not secrets. There's a whole book been written on this by two prominent Sudanese scholars, scholars of Sudan, about this relationship. And also it was the case that in the 1990s, for 6 years, bin Laden was a welcomed guest of the Sudanese government. And the most prominent theologian and political figure, one of the most powerful Islamist figures, an intellectual, Hassan al-Turabi, I've known him for 22 years now, Hassan al-Turabi's niece married bin Laden. At least that's one of the reports. I have been unable to confirm some of these things, but it's in the literature. It's in a number of other books that he married one of his nieces. And Turabi's son went into business with bin Laden, and they're breeding stallions for racing. And politically, Turabi's worldview is very similar to bin Laden. In the 1990s, before there was a breach between Turabi, this Islamist leader, and Bashir, They hosted most of the radical Islamist groups in the Arab world, or the Muslim world, actually, in Sudan as their base of operations and training ground. So a lot of African countries and Arab countries were a little nervous about, not little, very nervous, about the relationship between Iran and these radical groups. And there was an attempt in 1995 to assassinate President Mubarak while he was at a African Organization of African Unity meeting in Addis Ababa, and it was all traced back by the Ethiopian police to Sudan. In fact, Tarabi may have given the orders to working with a radical group in Egypt to attempt to assassinate Mubarak. So from a geostrategic point of view, there is an interest in Sudan in terms of its relationship. And the base of operations for Iran in sub-Saharan Africa has been Sudan for a long time by agreement. So I think there is and there's also, we've spent billions, I spent a lot of money myself as head of AID in two different iterations. 25 years ago when I ran the disaster relief functions, we were in Sudan big time, and the largest donor both in relief and long-term development in the South now is the United States. Through Democratic and Republican administrations we've been there. So we have spent billions of dollars on relief and development because of successive civil wars. I don't want to go into the whole history of Sudan. Most of my book, 80% of it is the last 30 years. I had to do some introductory chapters, but just to suffice to say that from 1821 until 1956, January 1st, 1956, when Sudan became independent, it had a relationship with Egypt. It's not truly colonized because they didn't send large numbers of Egyptians or British in to colonize the country in the way they did in other parts of the British Empire. In this case, it was done through local power elites. This was called indirect rule. It was a different structure, and they didn't report through the colonial office in Britain, but it was jointly administered for much of the first half of the 20th century by Egypt and by Britain together. 56, they became independent. Even before the Civil War, the independence took place, a civil war started because the southern part of Sudan at the time was African, ethnically African, and was animist or Christian. I shouldn't use the word animist, actually not accurate, because the religious traditions in southern Sudan are monotheistic. So they do not ascribe to rocks and trees, divine. In fact, the reason Christianity has spread so rapidly in southern Sudan, probably the most rapid Christianization of any population in the last 30 years in southern Sudan, is because their traditional religious beliefs are very similar to Christianity in many, many respects. And the northern part of the country is Muslim and Arabized. Now, I use the word Arabized carefully. This is a very sensitive subject in the Southerners, and some Sudanese intellectuals in the north would argue that the reason that the Sudanese have historically treated the South so poorly is because they are insecure about their own Arab culture. They are not genetically Arabs. They are African tribes that have lost their traditional languages, in some cases, and become Arabized by adoption, not by being part of Arab culture in a historic sense. And as a result of that, when they travel abroad, they're not treated very well in Arab countries. In fact, you can just read press accounts of senior Sudanese officials going to Lebanon or sometimes Egypt or Saudi Arabia, being treated as though they were, a lower category of people because of their race. And when they claim to be Arabs, people get sort of angry in these other countries. So there is a tension over self-identification. Before the South became independent, 55% of Sudan, north and south, was ethnically self-identified Africans, and 45% were self-identified Arabs. Okay? 70% were Muslim of the historic Sudan, 20% were Christian, and 10% were traditional religions. And that is the source of a lot of the tension in the society. The countries had for 200 years a set of centrifugal forces pulling the country apart. The two civil wars, without going to all the detail, lasted from 56 with one interim period of about 11 years under General Numeri, where there was a tenuous peace. The second civil war ended in I was there with Colin Powell when the agreement was signed in front of 10,000 people at a stadium in Kenya, in Nairobi. There were many heads of state there, foreign ministers were there. Powell represented the United States. The comprehensive peace agreement was signed by both sides, and the second civil war ended. The second civil war killed about 2.3 million people. It's interesting, in the Darfur civil war, it's not really a civil war, the Darfur rebellion, I call it a rebellion because at the beginning there was no intention to separate from the rest of Sudan, although there is separatist tendencies now in Darfur because the atrocities have been so bad. The Southerners deeply resent the whole movement in the United States and in Western Europe toward Darfur. They said, where were all of you when we were being slaughtered? 4 million out of us died, 300,000 Darfuris died, and you're all running to support them. How come you didn't say anything when we were being killed or we were being destroyed, our villages were being burned, our women were being raped? Why did you say nothing? You were silent. So there is tension, and it's interesting that the people who committed the atrocities in southern Sudan, the Sudanese military, were principally recruited from Darfur. And right now, before, the southern tribes that made up the South and their political movement were allied in the last few years with the Darfuri rebels. And I remember when Salva Kiir, the southern president, invited the southern rebels, when I was the U.S. envoy, I was worried a new civil war was going to start, to the south to form an alliance. Salva Kiir, who I know very well, said, we'll welcome you, but we're going to forget what you did to us during the Civil War. Oh, because you were the ones who killed all of us in the Northern Army. You were, because Darfur was like the South was in the first half of the 20th century in terms of disproportionate place for recruitment into the military. The generals were all from the Nile River Valley and around Khartoum, but the soldiers were from Darfur. So what we see historically in Darfur, in Sudan, is a war between the center, Khartoum, and the periphery of the country. And some people in the West have said, well, this is a religious war. There is huge religious implications to this between the North and the South, between Christianity and Islam. However, it is simply not the case that that is the only conflict and the only force pulling the country apart. It is also the center versus the periphery. If you go to Greater Khartoum, North Khartoum, and they call them the three cities, and Omdurman, they're a huge complex of about 5 million people, 6 million people. Right now, it looks like the Gulf states. There are cranes everywhere. There are towers going up. There are traffic jams. They're going into a recession now because they've lost the oil revenue that went with the South when the South became independent last summer. But it's a boom town. And if you look at the per capita income of that area, it's 20 times higher than the rest of the country, which is mired in poverty and underdevelopment. And none of this oil wealth that was going into the north got out to the rural areas. And so there's deep resentment in the periphery of the north, not just the south, against the central government for developing the north. In fact, 3 small tribes that make up 5% of the population of the country have controlled the country for 175 years. Even when the Egyptians came in 1821, they allied themselves with these tribes in the Nile River Valley. They've run the country. 70% of all the cabinet positions, the presidents of banks and big companies, university professors, all the generals, civil servants, all come from these small tribes. And this is the debate. And what's happened now is these 3 tribes are losing control. Bashir is one from and most of his party are from these tribes. And what we're seeing now is the country breaking apart. And this went formally with the comprehensive peace agreement that I mentioned earlier was signed in January of 2005. In that agreement, it allowed the South to have a referendum in January of last year, a year and a half ago, as to whether or not the South would separate. Bashir actually believed, he told me, we can convince the South if you will help us to remain united, to vote against separation, vote against independence. And I said, Mr. President, that's your job. I mean, we can certainly help with some of our assistance, but It's your job to prove to the South that they can be an equal part of the country, not a civil war. I mean, if you killed 4 million people or led to the death of 4 million people in my country, there'd be a lot of resentment over it, a lot of deep wounds. And he actually blamed us in the West for the failure to convince the South to stay in Sudan. When the vote finally took place, and it was a free and fair election, there were every international organization in the world, every NGO, every country had observers there. There was no interference. And Bashir did not interfere. He did pay people off. The amusing thing is they were spreading money around the South to vote against secession. And Salva Kiir would give these amusing speeches where he'd say, take the money and vote for independence. And that's exactly what they did. The vote was 98.5% in favor of independence. 98.5%. Almost a completely unanimous vote. All right? That took place January of last year. On July 9th, independence took place formally. There was a 6-month interim period before it actually formally took place. I went for 6 days at the invitation of the Southern government as their guest to the independence celebration. It was 110 degrees. In 7 hours in the sun, I can take heat, but that was a lot of heat, I have to say. But it was since I've been involved with the country for so long, it was a very powerful event. And President Bashir and the entire Arab leadership of the North came, including Hassan al-Turabi. He was at the next table from me. I talked to him and said, it's Dr. Karabi, it's astonishing that this has ended peacefully. The South is left peacefully. The problem is that there has been an element of the northern ultra-nationalist Arab elites in the North that never supported the peace agreement. I believe the great majority of the North supports the peace agreement and does not want to go back to war. Because if they go back to war in a big way, they will destroy the entire country. It will look like Somalia. For those of you who know anything about Africa, Somalia has not had a national government, functioning national government, for 25 years now. We do not want that to happen to Sudan. It will be a catastrophe for the people. The death rates will be enormous. There will be no development, and there will be chaos. We do not want that to happen. But there's a real risk that it could happen because the hatred, there's no other way of putting it, the hatred and the suspicion between the North and the South is enormous. Now, the outside world tends to think of the Southerners as hating because of all the people who died and the atrocities that were committed. When I first went in June of 1989, there was a cable in the U.S. Embassy which said, we have reports, verified reports, that the northern government, this is before Bashir became president, this is under a democratically elected government, they were taking southern soldiers who were captured in the rebellion and crucifying them as their means of execution. So you want to be Christians? That's how you're going to die. That did not go over too well in southern Sudan when that was happening. And these kinds of atrocities were so horrific. When it started happening in Darfur, which is entirely Muslim, then people realized this is not just a Muslim-Christian thing. It's being committed against African Muslims in Darfur. And that's when the outside world began taking more attention. Now, what's happened is in June, President Bashir, who's been afraid of a coup for a long time. There's a constant fear. They keep moving generals, retiring them, moving them around. And the military is demoralized by all these years of fighting. They keep losing battles. The Southern Army, there's an army in the South of 150,000 troops. It's one of the largest land armies in Africa. And they want to go back to war to take out the North. They're fed up with the northern regime, the northern government. And there have been 40 battles, small-scale battles, between the Northern Army and the Southern Army since June of last year. The North has won 2 battles and lost 38 to the South. So the Southern Army doesn't have an air force, they don't have anti-aircraft weapons, but they are highly motivated, and they have been through a lot, and they've been through civil war for 23 years, and they know how to fight. And now they have weapons because they've used their oil revenues to buy weapons. So what happened then in June is we don't know for sure, we believe, the UN says this, there have been articles on it, there was an internal coup, and the generals and the head of the secret police basically told President Bashir, we're taking over because you guys have screwed this up, you let them go, all their oil wealth has went with them, all this mineral wealth has went with them, all of that farmland, control over the Nile River that goes through the South, now we've lost that, and you And there's massive corruption in the northern government. There was a WikiLeaks cable that said, according to the U.S. Embassy, that Bashir had taken $9 billion, looted the Treasury himself. The one subject that will get you arrested in Khartoum right now is mentioning the corruption issue, because that is inflaming northern opinion right now. And there's corruption in the South, too, but it is not systemic to the same degree. It is individuals because of very weak institutions. And the South is trying to deal with this corruption, but there is corruption in the South. So my view is, this is a disputed question, that Bashir is not in control. The generals let him stay as head of state, but they're telling him what to do. And the UN is reporting that generals appear at all the meetings with Sudanese government officials. And it's very clear the generals are calling the shots. And the generals believe the only way to put Sudan back together again is military victory, which means they have to be delusional because they haven't been winning. They haven't been winning for a long time. They think they can bomb the South into submission with their Air Force, and most of the Air Force at this point are mercenaries. They're Egyptian, Iranian, Russian pilots, because the worst risk of a coup comes from the Air Force in poor countries. And a South African security firm that President Bashir hired said the first thing you need to do is you can't have any Sudanese pilots here. It's very dangerous because they're going to have a coup, they'll take you out. So they have mercenary pilots who are just making money bombing. They're not there for political reform or anything like that. What happened last November is there's a dispute because the oil wells are in the south, but the oil pipeline goes through the north to Port Sudan. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the two countries. Okay, 50% of the northern budget was oil revenue. And 98% of the southern government budget, which was billions of dollars, is oil revenues. And both the north and the south have huge numbers of public employees. I try to do some estimates, but it's difficult. They don't publish all the figures of how many people in the payroll. They're massive. And the risk is, I said in my book was published just before what I'm about to describe happened, so it's not in the book. The second edition, I hope I will update it. What happened last November, is the northern government is beginning to destabilize. There are massive rises in food prices. They can't pay their employees because the revenue, when the South became independent, all that oil revenue moved from Khartoum to the southern treasury. It had been divided 50-50 over 4 or 5 years under the peace agreement. Now it's all in the southern treasury. And the North said, wait a second, you're not going to ship this oil out, unless you give us some of this. The typical international rate is 67 cents a barrel to move oil in a pipeline through a separate country. The North has been asking for $38 a barrel. And the Southerners said, you can't be serious. We're not going to pay you $38. No one pays $30. They don't even pay $1. Why should we pay you? And the Southerners realize, I've told them, and Princeton Lyman, who's my successor as the envoy, career diplomat, a good friend of mine, said, look, guys, if the North collapses into chaos, what's going to happen to the pipeline? It's going to be at risk. So what happened because they couldn't agree on a figure, last November, the North started pirating all the oil ships. They actually took them over in Port Sudan and started selling them off on international markets. Okay, so the Southerners for 4 months got no revenue from the oil companies that had rented or leased the land because they weren't getting any oil. Why? Because the government took the oil and sold it. So on February 1st, the southern government said, shut off all the oil wells. So they shut them down, and there had been no oil being pumped at all in this whole area since then. Because basically for 4 months they weren't getting any revenues, and the North stealing all the oil. This was not a good situation in terms of the future of the country. I had hoped that the agreement would lead to some kind of... but the Southerners tell you, we have a 1,300-mile border with a bunch of radical Islamists who are suspicious of us, and the security services run the country now, and they hate us. And we don't like them. We despise them. So there's no love lost. But I argue that economic symbiotic relationship should have driven them to work together, but that's not what's happening right now. Now what's happened is the generals just literally 2 months ago walked out of the negotiations in Addis Ababa. This is the generals from the north. They refused to negotiate. They said, you either give us everything, or they would not put any alternate proposals on the table. The Southerners at one point said, we'll give you $13 a barrel, which I thought was extremely generous. The North said, no, $38 a barrel or nothing. It will bomb you into hell. And that's, in fact, what they've been trying to do. So I wrote an article about a week ago in which I argued that we should provide an air defense system to southern Sudan to protect them, because their north is bombing southern cities now. No troops. They can't get into the south on the land, but they can bomb them. And they're terrorizing the population. There's a large number of displaced people now. There are also a serial revolt of the Darfur rebels, people in the Nuba Mountains and Abyei, which is in the central part of the country, and in the Blue Nile province, these are northern provinces now, that want a secular state, a secular democratic state with a multi-party democracy. That is what they are insisting on, and President Bashir wants an Islamic republic. In fact, the great bulk of the north, if they took a poll in the north, I don't believe that the radical Islamists would get more than 15, 20% of the vote. Hassan al-Turabi's party never got more than 17% of the vote in the last 50 years. So the great bulk of the northern Muslims are mostly Sufists, and the Sufists are very pacific, and they actually get along with the Southerners pretty well on a personal level, and they work together commercially and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of political ideology that's interfering with the settlement. They've gone back, last week they went back to negotiating at us. I'm not particularly hopeful, frankly, but the North is destabilizing. The South is unified because at one point they sent troops in to Heglig oil fields, which is one of the few oil fields that the North controls. It's north of the border. And they did it because the North was using that as a base to attack the South. So they said, wait a second, you're attacking the South, we're going to go and they took the oil fields. And there was a tumultuous scene in the parliament in Khartoum where Bashir's own party was attacking him, saying, how could you allow the Southern Army to take control of our oil field? And there was no fight. In fact, in some of the battles, the Northern Army will simply drop their weapons or they switch sides. Whole battalions have joined the South. They drop their weapons, they turn around, we give up, and we'll join your army, we'll be part of your army now. So there was a worldwide revolt against the Southern invasion of what was clearly in the North, and Salva Kiir pulled his army back after Ban Ki-moon and President Obama and the Prime Minister of Britain, President Sarkozy of France, called him personally. You can't invade another country. He said, they've been bombing us and you've done nothing about it for 2 months. I would think bombing, he said, is an act of war. How come you're demanding that we stop, but you won't stop them from bombing us? Anyway, the risks for all of us are this. There are vast resources in the country. And I think the South has, because they are under enormous pressure to use the oil revenues to develop the country. People say, oh, there's so much corruption in the North. There's corruption in most developing countries. It's a reality, unfortunate reality. The question is the level of it, whether it's systemic, whether there's a clique stealing large amounts of money, or whether it's simply weak institutions. In the case of southern Sudan, it's weak institutions. The South has tribal rivalries, which the North has been stimulating, and they've been giving weapons and money to tribal groups in the South to try to attack the Southern government. They did this during the Civil War for 50 years, and they're doing it again now from what evidence we see. So, is it a pleasant situation? It is not. I think it is in our interest from a strategic standpoint, from a human rights standpoint, from a humanitarian standpoint, not to let Sudan go the way of Somalia. It would be a disaster. I think it would be a disaster for the Arab world, for the African, because it will destabilize all of Central and East Africa if Sudan descends in. And it will not be a guerrilla war. If a war starts, it will be a bloodbath. There are still 700,000 Southerners who moved to Khartoum to avoid the civil war, who still live there. There had been 2 million, 2.7 million. 2 million came back to the South. 700,000 are still there. The North is terrified of them because they think that there were serial revolts of those displaced people. When John Garang, who negotiated the North-South Agreement, was the leader of the revolt for 20 years, died in a helicopter crash 6 weeks after he was sworn in, after the peace agreement was signed. He died in a helicopter crash. The Southerners all believe it was a conspiracy by the secret police to kill him. There's no evidence of that, but the Southerners, they don't accept it when I tell them. There's no evidence of that there was foul play, but all over the South, they think it was a conspiracy. There were riots in the Khartoum, and for 3 days the city burned. They were killing Arabs. There were Darfuri rebels, Darfuri displaced people from the war in Darfur who were around Khartoum, and there are Darfuri men raping Arab women, saying, you raped our wives, you raped our daughters, you raped our sisters, we're doing it to you now. So there is a fear that if this comes undone and there is a general uprising in the north, it will not be an orderly transfer of power. It will be a bloodbath. And I am very worried about that. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Andrew Natsios, former professor in the practice of diplomacy of the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and author of the book Sudan, South Sudan, and Darfur, What Everyone Needs to Know. We will return to our speaker momentarily for the traditional City Club questions and answers. We encourage you to formulate a question for our speaker and remind you that your question should be brief and to the point. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is our City Club Program Director, Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Mr. Natsios, early on you mentioned the seemingly intense interest of Iran in the situations there that are occurring and have and will occur in the Sudan. I myself am rather interested in Iran, and I wonder if I may ask what you think might be a final solution to the Iranian problem.
Well, that gets us a little off the topic of Sudan. I think it is a very difficult situation in dealing with Iran's nuclear ambitions. It does appear that Iran is a revolutionary power using traditional international relations theory, which is to say they appear to be attempting to overthrow the existing international order. The problem is the coalition they've put together of Venezuela and a few other countries is not going to overthrow the international system, but they can cause a lot of trouble. And all of the alternatives we have for dealing with Iran and the nuclear issue, because if Iran gets nuclear weapons, other countries in the region are going to follow very quickly, and the risk of a nuclear exchange at some point, not with us or the Russians or the Chinese in the area, but with among the countries in the area, increases diametrically if they get weapons. So there is, I think, a proper concern by our policymakers in Washington. This would be a disaster for controlling the spread of nuclear weapons. It would destabilize the Middle East in a profound way. I think Iran does have ambitions to be the dominant power in the Middle East, but of course the Saudis don't want that. The Israelis don't want that, given that they keep saying they want to wipe out Israel. And the Turks, no matter what the Turks are saying, they are very concerned about what's going on as well. So I think the alternatives aren't particularly without risk. All of them have risk associated with them. I'm not going to go here and I can tell you what my views are, but I'm not sure this is the appropriate time to do that. Option we should take.
Ambassador, my belief is that most of the wars in the world are fought for economic reasons, and they use religion as the cover. And I use the example when President Bush went to war, he had Billy Graham stay at the White House. When Saddam was going to war, he changed his flag and started showing up in mosques and so on and so forth. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it depends on the situation. The notion that religion is not part of the debate in Sudan is simply not true. It is. I mean, there are Islamic scholars who say there's nothing to do with it. That's just a cover. I mean, to say that Hassan al-Turabi personally memorized the entire Quran, that is not easy to do. I mean, it's very difficult to do. He's a great intellectual. He went to the Sorbonne. He's the dean of the Khartoum Law School. The notion that Hassan al-Turabi is not motivated by religion is simply not true. He's a Salafist. He believes, as you know, the Wahhabists believe that the only truth in Islam is the teachings of the Prophet himself, the Hadith saying, and the 4 generations following the Prophet. But that all successive Islamic scholarship since then is not legitimate or is heretical. That is his view. And he's quite an intellectual. I mean, I've had long conversations with him. He defends his... He uses our Western language and African democratic language to defend his position, but he uses the words, and he uses them with a different meaning. When he says democracy, he means a completely different kind of democracy than what we would traditionally think in liberalized countries. And so I think in the case of Sudan, we can't sidetrack religion. However, to suggest that there are not racial and cultural and profound economic issues is simply not true. I think the reason we're at an impasse here now is that oil, and it's not just oil, it's also the control of the floodwaters of the Nile River. One of the reasons the Second Civil War started is because the Egyptians in the northern Sudanese state were building a canal to increase the flows of that would have dried up the Sud marshes, which are vast. And John Grang, who led the Second Revolt, got his PhD at Iowa State. He did a dissertation attacking this Jonglei Canal, which would have increased the water flows by 8% on the Nile River, 6 to 8%. Egypt is going to run out of water in 2017. Let me define what I mean by that. It means the inflows of the Nile River will be less than the outflows, according to the Egyptian Water Commission. This is not me making it up. Egypt would not exist without the Nile River. It's just a giant desert. So if they are starting to have serious water deficits in 2017, it is a matter of survival for Egypt. What happens to the... And there are 5 dams being built in northern Sudan, north of Khartoum now, along the Nile River. And the Ethiopians are building a massive dam as well in Ethiopia on one of the 2 Nile rivers. There's the White Nile and the Blue Nile. So Egypt has a profound, their own survival is dependent on what happens to the Nile River water. And so this is not just a matter of religion, it's also economic resources. You are correct, but it is not the whole answer.
Mr. Natsios, I have a good friend in Columbus, Ohio, who has worked with some of the lost boys of the Sudan who are resettled there. And the 2 young men specifically he's worked with have identified a need in the home village which they came from, which they hadn't visited in 10 or 15 years from whenever they were evicted in, I believe, the first war, to put in a health clinic. And they've raised money locally. I've seen pictures that they've actually built a small building and hired a staff to begin to do things like do basic inoculations and do child care, health care for babies, for instance. My question is that if South Sudan is fairly prosperous now in terms of government revenues, how are they using those government revenues? And wouldn't this be one of the kinds of things they ought to be doing that, private philanthropy is basically doing, because the money's been raised to do this here in the U.S. primarily, I think?
Well, first, there's no revenue right now. There has been no revenue since November 1st of last year, so there is a budget crisis. 2, money was being used, but for the development of the South, building roads and all, but it's slow. Why? There's no government. There's never been a government in the South, really, effective government. And they've been building government. AID has been helping them. The World Bank, the European Union has been working with the Southerners to build the infrastructure needed to put the systems in place to do this. They have, my estimate is, they won't say this publicly, but my estimate is there are 400,000 Southerners on the payroll of the Southern government right now. Now, where do they come from? 125,000 were the regular army, the rebel army that led to the peace agreement, because in many respects there are 2 reasons why Bashir agreed to negotiate. One is he's afraid of the United States and George Bush, to be very frank with you. I can tell you because he kept repeating it. Okay? 2, they were losing the war to the Southern Army. They could not defeat them. There's no way the Southern Army could be defeated. They put those people on the payroll. Now, in order to defeat the Southerners, they put 175,000 Southern troops on the Northern government's payroll from different tribes to try to defeat. In other words, they used South-on-South violence to try to win the Civil War. So there were 70 militia groups in Southern that were on the payroll of Khartoum. In order to bring peace to the South, Salva Kiir had to take all those 175,000 troops and integrate them into the Southern Sudanese army. Why? You have a bunch of guys with guns in the countryside. What do you think they're going to do with the guns? They're going to cause chaos. So to avoid chaos, they have 300,000 people in their army. It's the largest land army in Africa. And if he puts those people off the payroll and lays them off, he's going to have violence all over the countryside. 100,000 people are on the payroll who were on the northern payroll in the cities of the south that were still controlled by the countryside was controlled by the rebels. The cities were controlled by the north. To keep order in the cities, they put every southerner who lived in the cities was put on the northern payroll. When the southerners, the peace agreement was signed, they tried to lay them all off, and there were riots in the southern cities. So they found once you get a job, it's very hard. There are no other jobs. You can go out and there's this cattle culture in the south, about 10 million head of cattle. You can go back to the cattle camps, but once you've been collecting a salary, not doing very much for it, you don't want to go back in the cattle camps. Bashir massively expanded the size of the northern bureaucracy, mostly in the secret police to keep control, but they went from 8%, 9% of the GNP to 22%. That's how the size of the government expanded when oil revenues came about. So a lot of the money is going to pay salaries. And I have to say, these people are principally not educated people. They don't have skills. What I would tell the Lost Boys, most of them getting degrees here. I met 2 Lost Boys in my office 2 weeks ago. One of them is getting his PhD from Howard University, and the other is getting his master's degree from Johns Hopkins. I said, you guys need to go back to be mayors and provincial leaders. You're educated people. They need you back there. Now, they go back to help, but some of them are a little nervous about giving up their American citizenship and their jobs in the U.S. because, you know, if you knew the conditions in Sudan, in the north and the south, you wouldn't do it very easily. So it looks easy. It's not as easy to do. Have they been building clinics? Yes. There's been a 400% increase in the number of children in schools. The number of cell phones prior to the war was 0. 5 years ago, there were virtually no cell phones. There are now 1 million cell phones in southern Sudan. There are now 7 water bottling plants. There were none 3 years ago. There's even a brewery. I'm not sure that was a great benefit, but there is a brewery. There are hundreds of hotels that have sprung up. So there is a market economy, but it's oil-based. All these people, they're getting salaries. They're spending the money. It's fueling the economy, but they're not getting salaries now, or they won't very shortly.
Thank you for talking with us today. Very enlightening. What would you care? Well, 2 questions, if I may. The first question is, what is our government's stance now with regard to North and South Sudan? And what you mentioned in that article or column, is that a possible outcome? And then the second question is, what is the best case scenario here? What, if you had your druthers, how would this end?
Well, first, let me say that I was one of the leaders in the NGO community and the church community here in the United States for 20 years on this issue, and I was regarded as a militant against the North. And when I was appointed, I was attacked by Bashir and his cabinet pretty brutally, not physically, but you know, when President Bush announced my appointment as envoy to Sudan, and they weren't going to let me even come into the country because they regarded me as extremely hostile. I realized that I had to become no longer a human rights advocate, but a diplomat. And diplomats deal with the real world. You have to deal with the reality in front of you if you're going to get some political agreements. Okay? Now, there's a whole movement in the advocacy community for regime change. They keep saying to me, Andrew, we've got to get rid of Bashir. I said it will make no difference whatsoever. If Bashir leaves, someone else will take his place. It'll be just as bad, if not worse. Bashir agreed to the South leaving peacefully. I know a whole bunch of other guys would have rather, they told me, that we would rather have the entire country go into chaos and give them their independence. One guy told me, he said, you know, if you force us out of office, I will make the country, before we leave, this is one of Bashir's cabinet ministers, completely ungovernable. And he knows how to do it, too, and I know exactly what he's going to try to do if they get forced out. So there is a real problem between the advocacy community, churches, synagogues, and human rights groups in the United States that want regime change, and the political reality that you think Thomas Jefferson is going to take over as the next president of Sudan, an Arab version of Thomas? I don't think so. Okay? But Bashir's destroyed the traditional parties. You know, they had a democracy 3 times. This is not like Egypt. Egypt's never been a democracy. Sudan was a democracy. They have a rich civil society. They had an independent court system. They had actually the Bar Association of Northern Sudan took out 2 presidents who were abusive. They had demonstrations in the streets, almost like Pakistan, where the judiciary revolted against the abuses and power of a dictator, and they got him out of power. You know, so there is a foundation to build a democracy in northern Sudan because it existed before, 3 times before. I think that, so our government, now when I left the envoy job, I wrote a very provocative article for Foreign Affairs in which I said, we need to stop the confrontation. The advocacy community needs to be restrained, and I went after them. They got very upset. I go after them in my book. I restrained myself, believe it or not, because they interfere, the advocacy groups interfere with my negotiations at critical moments. I just couldn't believe it that they would do this. In the middle of critical negotiations, they were giving advice to what to do to some of the rebels in Darfur. Anyway, so what I argued is we need to be more mediators. We need to use not sanctions and threat of regime change, but try to work with them. And it worked. The administration took a less confrontational position than Bush. Bush, from the advocacy standpoint, was much more powerful. And Bush is a national hero in southern Sudan and Darfur. Not in Khartoum, but in southern Sudan and Darfur. They named their children after Bush in Darfur. The rebels, the people, the tribes in revolt. They named their kids George W. Bush, believe it or not. Okay? Some people don't believe that. Go to Sudan and ask them. Okay? So, but President Obama has taken a more moderate role to put it in career diplomats in charge of this and said, try to fix this diplomatically. Okay? I think it worked brilliantly until last summer. I think we should have warmed relations with Bashir after the referendum. We should have taken some measures very rapidly after Bashir agreed to a peaceful separation of the South to show that we were going to do something. You know what the hardliners used to say? No matter what we do, we can never satisfy you people. We'll let them go and you'll screw us 2 minutes later, and that's exactly, we didn't do anything. Why? It's not because the president didn't want to do it or the State Department. It's because the atrocities they have committed are real. And they, you know, Bashir is under indictment. A whole bunch of his senior people are indicted by the ICC. I oppose the indictments. People say, how can you oppose indictments of war criminals? It's a choice between justice and peace. You can't have both. You cannot have both. I can tell you from experience in Sudan. If you ask the Sudanese people, they say they all want them on trial. They want to shoot them all. Okay? But then you say, would you prefer peace or justice? All of them want peace. Because they know what justice may mean a civil war, a new one. So I think we should take the diplomatic route, but it's not working very well. I took this provocative action, because I became a hero in Sudan, northern Sudan, when I called for a moderate approach, a diplomatic approach. Now they're furious with me because this book goes after them. I didn't go after them, I just described what they did in very moderate tones. I mean, there are other histories of Sudan that really describe in extreme language what they did. It's horrific what they did. But we can't lie about what happened. We cannot lie about what happened. So my view now is the generals are in charge. We need to tell the generals, if you want to try a military attempt to crush the South and the rebels, you're going to lose. Because we're going to give the South anti-aircraft weapons, which are defensive in nature. An air defense system is by nature, the only reason you use it is if you're being bombed. Okay? So I was in Al Jazeera 2 days ago describing this, and the Arab press says, oh, Natsios wants to arm the South. I said, oh, the South is already armed on the ground. They don't have an air defense system, which needs some sophistication. It would work, and it would tell the generals, it would be a diplomatic message to the generals, your military option is at an end. You send the Air Force down, we're going to shoot it out of the air with these air defense systems. So go back to the table and make a deal, a compromise. The only thing that's going to save Sudan is the generals stepping back, letting some civilians in the north sit down with the civilians from the south to make a set of political deals to resolve 5 or 6 issues. I'm not going to go through them all because we're running out of time. Unless you do. If you want me to go through the remaining issues in the last 5 minutes, I can do that. But it's the border area between the north and the south. It's oil revenues, what to do with that. It's what to do with Abyei. It's what to do with the Nuba Mountains. It's whether or not the north will become an Islamic state or a secular democratic state that allows people, regardless of their religious beliefs, to live as they wish. with to unleash civil society. There are a large number of civil society organizations in the north. I know them well. Some of them are friends of mine. Some of them are in jail now because Bashir's arresting everybody. They're arresting right now all the Protestant pastors and the Catholic priests in the camps around Darfur, among the southern. These are southern priests and pastors because they're worried about an uprising. And who would cause it? They're worried the church leaders will do it. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Andrew Natsios, former professor in the practice of diplomacy at Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and author of the book Sudan, South Sudan, and Darfur, What Everyone Needs to Know. Professor Natsios will be in the lobby. The books are for sale, and he's happy to autograph your copy. Thank you, Professor Natsios. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.